All right, good afternoon. Scott Lang here with my colleague Dan Freeman. And today we're going to be talking about new strategies in athletics fundraising. We had a session about the impact of name, image, likeness a couple months back, and we wanted to revisit the subject again because it's constantly changing. So without further ado, I'll let Dan get started. I'm going to share my screen so that you all can see what we're going to be discussing. And please note that at any time you like, you're welcome to submit a question and Dan will respond at that moment. You don't have to wait to the very end. So without further ado, Dan, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey everybody. As Scott said, I want this to be interactive. So if I'm going through a slide and you have a question, please submit a question so we can talk about it. I think that's the best way to get this going. So we're going to talk about creating critical fundraising strategy for collegiate athletics. So some of the points we're going to hit on for this agenda in this presentation is the NIL era landscape, the case for integration, how to implement it, success strategies, and then conclusions and next steps. And you'll see in these slides, we want to keep it pretty simple. I'll make some comments throughout on different things, other pieces. We just want to make sure you know some of these statistics as well, because this really helps frame and educate if you haven't seen some of these numbers. So let's go to the next slide. So welcome everybody. As we mentioned in a deeper purpose, this webinar is about integrating athletic fundraising into institutional wide advancement strategies. I started my career in collegiate athletics. Technically, I started it in marketing, sales, sponsorships, being around the foundation at my first institution, being around donors and building those relationships, which I didn't even realize were part of that advancement strategy. And then moving into collegiate athletics for a number of years, and then realizing the liaison work that I had done between athletics and institutional advancement. There was a lot of experience that I gained, and I felt like I could use that going into the overall fundraising strategy for the institution. And with that being said, we talk about me having been a liaison. Athletics is not a separate fundraising silo, but a strategic component of college's overall advancement ecosystem. So let's jump in with some numbers to start. So the current state, athletic donations, $2.7 billion annually, 18%, almost a fifth of total higher education giving, which is really interesting. And I think just at the start, that really talks about how we say when I was in athletics and now it's the front porch, right? Someone may not be interested in your engineering program, but they may see your athletic team on TV. They may see the bus driving on the highway, depending on the size of it. You may be in a city and there may be flags all over, digital billboards, regular billboards. It's really important to see that a fifth of higher education giving goes to athletics. Now, what's really interesting is just under half of that general number, not within the 2.7, but in general, is NIL deals. Now, we know that a lot of that at the height is obviously the revenue generating sports, which is really basketball and football. But it's still important to know, and as we all know, with things literally changing day after day, that it can be the Wild West. And not just for the student athletes, but really for advancement shops trying to figure out how do you balance a donor who loves athletics or may love a specific player and wants to win more than they want to see an academic program change. How do you balance that? And you can kind of see our sources underneath that, where they came from. So key challenges, as I started talking about them in the last slide, 43% of traditional athletic donors are redirecting to NIL collectives. I know from my time in athletics, when I first really got in and was full time in athletic fundraising, I was doing lots of cold calls. I was getting lots of people responding to me who were not happy when our teams were losing. And truthfully, I think it taught me a lot about fundraising, but it also gave me insight to understand that people who give to athletics, there are a lot of people who give for the love and success of the sport. Sometimes it's the student athletes, sometimes it's the sport in general, but 43% of those donors redirected to NIL collectives because they believed that if they could give directly to the collectives, which gave directly to the athletes, it would keep the athletes, which would allow them to win more, which creates a better product. Now, fragmentation of giving streams creates donor confusion. Now, with collectives, and we know some things have changed, some were external collectives, some were brought internal, and then some are kind of doing their own type of thing, and some don't even have those streams. But it's really important, especially we know in higher education right now, transparency is the most important thing, and to over explain is really, really important in the work that we do. I just had a conversation today with a donor who went out to some business owners that he'd worked with for quite some time. And he asked me, he's like, I want you to send me some zingers. He was like, I want you to send me some information about sponsorships, about these events, because my goal is that I want to make it easy for him to understand what's going on. And that does not change. And it's even more important in the world when everything is changing so quickly. And then 73% of athletic departments reports to increase compliance costs because that's a lot of contracts to go through. That's a lot of getting student athletes to send you exactly what's happening. And seeing that, I think it's really important to understand if there's increased compliance costs, that mean that there are expenses and there's movement of money potentially away from fundraising because that money is going to NIL. So it's really important to be aware and to be versed and educated to be able to, as we'll talk about in some later slides, be able to talk to many different points in value areas. So the case for integrated data-driven benefits. Now, we know here at Visionary that data is huge for us. We use data in all of the work that we do. Integrated programs see 31% higher lifetime donor value. Now, we know that the data has shown that donors who have a stronger affinity to an area are likely donors that give to multiple areas within an institution because it expands their affinity to that. And first-time athletic donors are 2.5 more likely to give to academics when approached through integrated campaigns. And institutions with integrated fundraising shows 23% higher total giving. Now, what's really important to understand is early on in this, I mentioned fundraising the front porch, right? If you've worked in athletics, everyone knows that. Athletics is how you get people in, right? But if you get people in because your team's doing well and then your team doesn't do well in that next year, are they going to be interested in coming to see that product? The product being the winning team. Sometimes they're not going to be, and it may be a lot less likely because they're only coming to watch a game with their kids, with their family to enjoy it. And when someone's losing, it's obviously not as fun. But what's really important is to be able to integrate those athletic donors and expand their affinity to the institution. Now, that's something that I know early on in my career in athletics and why I was a liaison. It's not easy, and that's not the norm. Athletics likes to be separate, but if you want people to continue giving to athletics, you have to be able to expand that affinity beyond wins and losses to the student athletes and beyond the student athletes to not the whole student body, but the connection from athletics to the student athletes and how that connects to the whole institution as well. And that's the reason why integrated fundraising has a 23% higher total giving. So, strategic advantage, avoiding donor fatigue. I've had this conversation with people recently. A lot of people, including myself, I have the view that donor fatigue is not people getting tired of uncoordinated solicitations, which it is to a degree, but what it is people being bored. They're not interested in giving to the same thing time after time. That's why crowdfunding campaigns, especially for athletics, they have to be targeted, they have to be segmented, and they have to be different. Every single one, even if it's a slight difference, whether it's the email subject, whether it's the body of it, whether there's some personalization within that outreach, has to be different. 64% of donors report receiving multiple uncoordinated solicitations. We talk about integration having an over 20% increase in giving. In that last slide, this is why you want to have a coordinated approach. You know that if you go to someone and you talk to them, and then someone on your team goes to them and says something different, that makes you look bad. And then it confuses people. And if you go back a few slides before, like we talked about, you don't want to make things confusing, especially right now, as we know, NIL is changing from day to day and week to week. You want to make sure your giving and your story is fully connected from athletics to student athletes to the impact on the institution as well. And coordinated outreach calendars show a 29% reduction in complaints and 17% higher response rate. And that means not only do you need to work on a coordinated calendar, or at least if it's not a calendar, have conversations with your colleagues in communications and marketing in fundraising, or your communications and marketing colleagues in the institution in that department. Knowing when those things are getting sent out and who they're getting sent to is extremely important. And that goes back to my point earlier about segmentation. A way to get around and to have a reduction in complaints and higher response rates is to make sure that the people you're reaching out to are segmented. You don't want to send your outreach to just mass people every single time. The more specific you get, the more affinity people are going to feel because you're reaching out to them for something that is very specific for how they feel. And when you reach those people, if you're able to make connections to the larger picture, what I always say is you need to be able to see the forest through the trees. You could look at being that specific segment as being the trees. And if you can connect that to the forest being the institution, that's how you expand people's views of what's going on and how to make an even larger impact and how it's all connected. So strategic advantage, maximizing limited resources. Right now, I work at Gaston College in North Carolina, and we have a pretty little budget. And I'm always looking at ways to increase my capacity and being thoughtful, effective, and efficient. Now, integrated teams operate with a 22% lower cost per dollar raised. That makes a ton of sense because we know about decentralized versus centralized shops. If you talk to people, and I did some research when I was at previous institutions, I've worked in mainly decentralized fundraising shops, but I've had other experiences in centralized fundraising shops. When you have integrated teams, and I'm going to say integrated is just centralized to a degree, centralized shops means that everyone's communicating, everyone almost always knows what's going on because you all work together. When they're not integrated, you become siloed and it's decentralized and everyone works individually. That's when people get multiple emails, things get redundant. People are not communicating, they're just reaching out to the same people. And there isn't that exact segmenting and conversation. And then cross-trained gift officers secure 37% more gifts annually. I always looked at being a regional gift officer, being a central gift officer, whether it's a centralized shop or decentralized. I know in my last institution, we had centralized gift officers and we had decentralized gift officers for the colleges and institutes and athletics. Having those cross-trained gift officers allows the gift officer to talk about the trees, aka athletics, even potentially NIL, and be able to explain what's going on with that, but then be able to tie in what majors are those student athletes, about the data of how those student athletes are succeeding in the classroom across the institution and beyond. And then not just that, being able to work with their colleagues about that. It's a lot easier in centralized shops for planned gifts. We know that in athletics, unless you're at a very big shop, you're not you're probably not going to have a specific individual who has expertise in planned giving, like you would on the institutional side. So having cross-trained gift officers and/or integrated teams allows you to work on the university side as well and use those resources to help you. So if you can be cross-trained on what's happening and then be able to bring in colleagues with expertise that goes beyond yours, you're working together. We know that split gifts bring in more money than individual gifts, and you're creating that synergy across the institution. Strategic advantage, building strong donor relationships. So multi-channel donors, 83% higher retention rates, 2.7 higher lifetime value. That's incredible. Almost 3 times a higher lifetime value. And athletic events drive 3.2 more first-time alumni engagement. So again, we'll go back to athletics being the front porch. Because people love sports and they don't have to know a lot about it, but they love watching a good product, athletic events are such a great way to bring in people who may not feel super connected to your institution. And we know that that can be alumni, people who went to school there, got a degree there. They may not be involved or engaged at all. But if they want to come see a good athletic event and you have a good product on the field, they're going to come in. And that's going to expose them to everything else happening. And having an integrated relationship shows that if they come in and they see that athletic piece, but then they see alumni relations is there, or they see the program that they graduated from, et cetera, they're going to be exposed to more of those things versus just individually. And it's just really important, as I mentioned earlier, before I want to pull this back with this 83% higher retention rates for multi-channel donors. The way that I look at it, for a great example, is we have a radio station here. And when I look at that radio station, there are so many great alums and friends who give to that. And I tend to think to myself, if we can expand their affinity beyond it, because they may not know about the college, they may only know the radio station, that's going to increase their affinity. And because we know the data shows that split gifts bring in more opportunity and larger gifts, it's going to increase the affinity. It would potentially increase a gift, and it's going to benefit more than one part. And we know that even if athletics feels itself separate, if university advancement feels itself separate, we know that they have to work together and there's benefits to that. Demonstrating broader institutional value. Average Division I program generates 13.8 in annual advertising equivalency. And successful athletic programs see 11 to 18% higher application rates. We see this every year after March Madness. That is that synergy that we're talking about. When athletic programs go to the Final Four or the Elite Eight or the Sweet 16, whatever it may be, if a team gets to the national championship or is in the playoffs, doesn't even matter what sport now. We've seen what women's volleyball does and how they have just completely filled out stadiums. We know what sports can do now, especially sports that weren't always considered revenue generating. And we can see that connection between more eyeballs being on that sport and how it exposes people to say, well, these student athletes are doing really, really great things. They're having a great experience. Well, my child should look at this. Or maybe they have continuing education classes. And all of it goes back to that front porch. And athletics is that easiest place that is the most really advertised for institutions out there beyond the walls and beyond the region and the county. So, implementation framework. So, the first thing that is really important is the assessment. So, integration, readiness, assessment overview. Only 23% of institutions score above integration ready. So, what's really important, and the way that we kind of view it, and athletics is a little bit newer for us, higher education is not, is can these departments integrate smoothly? Who's covering what positions right now? What do portfolios look like? How many alumni are there? How many friends are there? What's being raised each year? Who's kind of covering certain resources? Are there prospect management individuals? Is prospect management and research the same? Does athletics have that right now? How's that being found? Are you using the same fundraising software? Hmm. I know that when I was at one of my first institutions, we were using two other software that the university wasn't. And we had to continually integrate that. And it was not helpful at all. It was a whole nother piece that just made things more difficult. And truthfully, there can be a lot of resentment in that and having to bring it into, go from an athletic system to a university system and having to continually do that. So what we do first is we look at that readiness assessment and say, where are you at? Where is the institution at? Where are the synergies? Is there anyone that's already working together? And then something really interesting too is looking at those donors who give to athletics and other areas. What does that look like? Because when you look at the data, that's probably not what a lot of people are looking at because everyone is really looking at how is it supporting my area? How is it supporting my area? But I would encourage you to look and see how many donors currently give to athletics and how many currently give to other priorities at your institution. So quick wins, right? We're always looking. When I came into my role, the first thing I wanted to do was optimize. I didn't want to come in and break things and throw things around. I wanted to come in and say, what's in place? How do we move forward in an effective way? How do we optimize everything that's already in place? And how can I build out a plan to successfully adjust things for next year? First thing, joint communication calendar for implementation. We use OneDrive. We're a Microsoft school. Really great way to do that. We also have biweekly meetings with our marketing communications team in our cabinet right now, where we can talk back and forth about what's going on, who has what. You can see or who has what going out. Um, it's important to note too, athletics tends to do newsletters, right? Whether it's in fundraising or in general. And it's important to look at that and say, is there a way to put fundraising in that? Is there fundraising in that already? Is there a way that we can integrate so that we don't have to send out multiple emails with multiple different things, but we're not making an email too long? How can we effectively do that? And we have shared database access protocol, just like what I spoke about in that last slide, talking about where are you? Where's your data? Where is it housed? Are people inputting properly? Because I know in places I've been, one of the most important things to me is to move forward, you have to have the information from meetings, from emails, from phone calls in your system. You have to have that correct data. It is so important because you're probably not going to be in that role forever. And to be able to move relationships forward in the future, you need to have those things. Weekly athletic and advancement leadership meetings. So I'm going to give a shout out to UNC Asheville when I was there. That was something that we did that I was invited to, and my athletic colleagues and our advancement colleagues. That was how I met some of my friends, including a best friend right now, a Daryl, was through those meetings. And we literally talked about prospects in those meetings. And we talked about what meetings were we going on? Who were we meeting with? Were there any gift proposals in the works? Were there any asks? Even sponsorships, right? Because the integration of that and those meetings is so important because you may be talking about a business, but someone else in the university side may say, hey, I know the owner of that business. We have them in our system. They gave XYZ, but they haven't been interested in something else. Let me make an introduction, or let me tell you who that is and share with you the information about previous meetings they had so that you can be educated heading into those meetings. And then 80%, 83% of successful integration efforts begin with communications, transparency, communication, not just with donors, but within fundraising is so important to be able to collaborate. Everyone's an expert in something different. And to be able to have experts on your side, whether you're one of them or not, is so important so that you can make sure that you're educated when you're speaking about all of these different topics that may not necessarily be in your wheelhouse, because that's not going to look good and consistent to a donor if you misspeak, but they can find something correct online. So medium term strategies, 3 to 9 months, right? So some quarters. So align KPIs between athletics and institutional advancement. If your shop, we know again, athletics can sometimes be on the sides of it. I know that So it's gotten better, but I know previously metrics were not a thing. It was we need to raise this amount of money to keep the lights on. And that was always that was always the key. But then institutional advancement always had metrics, always had small goals that they were reaching for and larger goals. And having the alignment of that, one, I think creates camaraderie because everyone is going in the same direction. Everyone knows, okay, I'm working on contacts, proposals, gifts, etc. And then everyone can be swimming in that same direction, and no one feels between athletics and institutional advancement. No one feels like, well, they're working on this and I'm working on this, but these are apples and oranges. If you want to have that integration, there needs to be consistency and alignment between those KPIs. The second one is cross-functional development meetings. There's nothing better, and I've done this before, there's nothing better than going out with a colleague that you maybe have gotten to know, or someone who, as I mentioned in the last slide, is an expert. The key is to be an expert in your area. And if you can go with more than one expert and you can blow away the donor with the statistics that you know, the data that you know, the stories that you know, and be able to tie that into the institution with another colleague who is also an expert in their area, that's how you go prepared to meetings. It's not about writing down everything you think can happen, but it's about having experts with you, and one of them in being yourself, to have those cross-functional, that synergistic development meetings. Shared stewardship programs. We know a lot of athletics still is, and in the past was give to get, quid pro quo type of deals. And we know some of that had to change with the PSLs, with tickets and with different tax laws. We know those things had to change, but if you can merge some of that athletic into the stewardship programs, whether it's event invites, et cetera, or athletic events with the institutional side, not only are you going to have shared stewardship programs and consistency, you are now exposing those institutional donors to athletics. And that is really what you're looking for to create that uh, cross-sectional donor affinity. And as it says here, institutions using shared KPIs saw 37% higher fundraising goal attainment. Everyone swimming in the same direction is so, so, so important. So organizational models that work. The hub and spoke approach. We talked about centralized and distributed execution. So centralized is really great because everyone's swimming in the same direction, everyone's communicating, they're all part of the same group. And I know from experience and conversations I've had with friends through my next gen fundraising group that I'm with, and other friends who are in the business, that it can be tough for individuals to go from a decentralized athletic department to a centralized institutional fundraising or institutional advancement department, because athletic fundraisers do tend to work at a different pace than others because of what they're used to and when money is needed in athletics. So there's this centralized approach with distributed execution. That's really a centralized team. There are no separate fundraisers necessarily that are separated in schools, but you may have to have some specificity. Being with athletics, you may have to know about athletics. You may have to know about recreation. You may, and honestly, it connects really well if you have an exercise science program or a sport management program. That may be a really great way for distributed execution, that you can be connected, because there's all connections through that, through athletics, sport management, exercise science, whatever that may be. Dual reporting development officers for athletics and academics. If you can speak to the whole institution, like we spoke about before, and be an expert in that and be able to know just enough, or to be able to bring in someone, that's so important for the university. Athletics has their expenses that they have to hit. We all know that. We have been through it. I've been through it as well. But we know that with growth, I remember that when I was a student athlete, I had friends, we'd walk through the uh, we'd walk through the kind of the across from the student union when I was at Charlotte, and I would just see people every few feet, and my friends would be like, "How do you know that person?" And I'd say, well, I had class with them or I spent time with them later that week. And to me, that was my first exposure to kind of expanding beyond feeling like just a student athlete and being part of that larger body. And I encourage that for fundraisers as well, because if our job is to help fulfill the passions for those that we're working with, they're going to have passions more than athletics. And you have to be able to learn and ask the right questions to figure that out. And you can see here, case example, University of Michigan's integrated model for 28% giving increase. I mean, almost 30% is incredible for to think about. I mean, really, in our world, we know that even if you can get a 10% increase, that's still really great for how things are moving and what money is like right now. That makes an impact. So, NIL era success strategies, donor education framework. 76% of traditional donors have no idea about NIL. I know it says limited, but I had that conversation with someone recently, and it is true. And we've talked about a consistent theme through this whole thing has been education, transparency, communication. Even if that means having a simple one pager that not just the athletic fundraisers have, but also the institution, those institutional fundraisers, decentralized or centralized, having a one pager that really explains what NAL is and how it works is really important so people understand. Because I guarantee you, if 76% have a limited understanding, they may think giving to NIL still has a same impact as giving to a scholarship or the athletic fund or giving to a team, and it doesn't. And it's so different. And that's where these issues come up is if people don't understand it, they're going to give to what they feel versus what they should know. Three-tiered education approach with sample communication templates. So we talked about in that the 76% of traditional donors having a one pager. It's really important to have an approach with sample communications because donors are going to ask you, and you really want to have a three-tiered approach in terms of you want to have an approach of this is exactly what an NIL is. And I save them in my drafts and copy them out whenever I send emails or if I have to talk to someone on the phone. The second piece is explaining the difference to people between what is NIL and what's giving to the athletic department, the athletic foundation, giving to the institutional foundation, and going to an athletic fund. And then I think the third tier is really just explaining to people that kind of one pager, but really just NIL focused. I don't think that people understand that it goes directly to the student athletes. And a lot of people still look at it and say, well, it's NIL and higher education. And then there are savvy ones that know what it does, but it's important to have that three-tiered approach to be able to answer what people are asking and to be able to be educated on what to give them. Institutions with formal NIL education see 62% higher donor satisfaction. If you're looking for something to engage donors, whether it's athletic prospects, whether it's people at your sporting events, create an engagement event by handing out flyers to people that come to games who you don't know and tell them that you want to have an event where you're going to have coaches, maybe you're going to have some athletes, and make it an NIL education, but invite people who come to those games who may not be athletic donors, they may be academic donors, but they just enjoy coming to the games. Use it as a chance to connect the athletics to NIL to the academic side and really educate those people. So compliance support structures, state by state, regulatory overview, three proven models for institutional NIL involvement, and transparency increases donor trust. So we've talked about that again through the whole thing. Transparency and communication improves donor trust. And then there are three donor models for institutional NIL involvement. And I can send that to you later on. I didn't want to bundle things up, but I wanted to share that there is a proven model to help with that institutional involvement and how to add those things together. But I can send that to you via LinkedIn or to the people who are interested following. And then leveraging athletic stories. We know, right? Working in athletics, student stories are key. Appeals featuring student athletes generate 37% higher response rates. We talk about connecting athletic development, athletic fundraising with institutional fundraising. And highlighting student athlete stories, that is the key. That's doing that because there's going to be an academic side in that. It's going to be athletic, academic, their experience. So writing those stories, the reason they generate high responses is because it connects to not just the athletic side, but the academic side as well. And then a good example is UCLA's champions made here, and they increased their athletic giving by 28%. Again, 30% increase is absolutely phenomenal. And you have to think about a place like UCLA that has so much history. If they can increase it by 28%, imagine if you took the time over the summer or you work with a consultant to get that. Imagine the return on investment that you would get if UCLA, who already has a strong involvement, imagine the potential for what you can do by making that connection and that approach. So, just kind of conclusion here. Before we open it up, I feel like we're doing good on time. This was kind of what I was hoping. Integrated strategies deliver 31% higher total giving, 47% better donor retention because of that increased affinity across multiple areas. If your team is losing and people get mad, they can stop giving to it because they're not winning. But my belief and what the data shows is that if you can increase their affinity across the institution, then that wins and losses record is not going to impact them as much because they're going to have a bigger affinity across the institution and they're not going to have their sights focused on the win and loss record. They may be thinking about an academic program. They may be thinking about mentorship involvement across the whole institution. And then because there's that integration and people are working together, especially we know right now being effective in our finances, 23% lower costs. We know because you're educating people on more than one area. So they can, as I always said, they can get more feathers in their hat, but they're educated and ready to go and speak on more than one thing, like centralized gift officers and regional gift officers. So schedule a joint athletics advancement leadership meeting. That is the first thing. That's easy. It can be small, depending on the level that you're at. Being in my role, being a chief development officer for our whole college, I am doing athletics. I'm doing everything across the board. But one of the things that I have is I work with our athletic director, and that's one of the things we have here. Our athletic director and the president. We talk about, okay, what do we have going on? Where are we? Where's money going? What are conversations looking like? And it can be a really honest and direct conversation with your advancement leadership to say, okay, we need to find some synergy. Where are we at? How can we work together? Are we having dual conversations? And this becomes really important with that data collection we talked about and that integration of systems. If you're using the same system, you should be able to look at donors, pull reports for athletic donors, people who gave most recently to athletics, their latest gift. You can see when that is. And then you can look at the latest contact as well. Like if you have Razor's Edge, that's one of the columns that you can look at. Conduct donor communication audits across departments. Really so important to look at your lists and see who is getting what. Because we talked about how the redundancy essentially it annoys people, but then you're going to start losing those open rates and those interactions because if you send too many, people don't know where to look. It really takes 2 to 3 days for people to look at their email, which is when I schedule follow-up resends to people who didn't open emails. I always do it at least 3 days after the initial email to give them time because we know we can be persistent on phone calls and emails and people appreciate that. But you have to give them a little bit of time to respond. And then map one student athlete story to the broader institutional priorities. One student athlete, you've got a successful one, you have one with a great story, someone who's doing an impact in the community, they're working with SAC, whatever student athlete development, whatever it may be. Pitch that one story and talk about that connection across the institution and the importance of how that can pull in athletics and academic people and put them in the same boat. So there's my email, my LinkedIn, our website, and I kind of just want to open it up for people. I've spoken a lot, so I'm going to take a drink and just be quiet and let people ask any questions they may have.
Well, Dan, thanks so much. And I'm going to start because I think at the beginning of this conversation, we didn't really know how NIL was going to affect athletic fundraising. And there was a real concern that those students who participated in what I would call traditionally non-revenue generating sports, you know, the guy I met at the local LA Fitness who was an Olympic rower and corrected my stroke on the rowing machine. Somebody that might be cross country skiing or a biathlete that's not going to sign the big deal. I'm wondering if you can make the analogy as we've done historically in campaigns. I've got several bullets or buckets. I've got student scholarship over here, endowment. I got a building I want to build. I need general operating support. And then I want dollars to go to our unrestricted endowment. And it could be that a donor might give to one and not to another. And we needed to develop blended strategies to fill all four revenue goals. Do you find yourself now having to do the same thing in athletics? Because you talked about that person who would give to the collaborative NIL fund, that's going to go directly to those athletes. What does that do to the balance of the sports, and how do we ensure that the women get the money they need and these other sports get the money that they need to continue on?
I think that's a great question, Scott, and it really goes back to a lot of things we spoke about is one is education, right? You need to educate your donors and the people in your ecosystem about how do things work? How does NIL work if you give to it? Where does it go? What does it do? And I think the second important thing as well is you have to know who your donors are and you need to understand what kind of impact they want to make. But to do that, you need to have a strong connection with institutional advancement. We have to have more than one expert, like I had mentioned before. Sometimes, well, not really sometimes, you don't know what you don't know. And being able to give people options, we know that data suggests that three options to people is the perfect number of options. Two options, people can't decide because they go back and forth. Three options allows them to actually make a decision because they can cancel out two others. So I think it's really important, especially in these situations where it's still new, is to make sure that people are educated, one. Two, you truly understand the donor. And three, you give them options with yourself as an expert and others as an expert, because we know that in philanthropy, to a degree, it's not everyone, it's about impact. If that person wants to impact a direct student athlete, which could totally be the case, then that's what they want to do. But we need to make sure that if they're going to make that commitment, they understand the impact that they can make in these other areas as well. That a capital project could impact hundreds or thousands of students, including student athletes. Maybe it's an athletic specific facility, including hundreds of student athletes versus just one. Or I've always talked about the transparency of finances. Is this the type of person who has capacity because they worked in the finance field, or they did XYZ, or they were CEO and they understand it? Going to them and saying, I know you want to help this person, but our data shows that over these number of years, when we expanded these scholarships and we had an increase of this, that there's a positive relationship between our winning percentages here, not just for one person. We didn't have one person, but it allowed us to expand our reach and bring in more people that created a stronger team that brought us more success over X number of years.
So, two related questions. One, I've got the fanatic football supporter, been buying season tickets year after year, actually has a box. To what degree do I consider introducing that individual to a story about a student that might be on our judo team, right? And not out on the football field. Do you consider that cross-contamination, or is that an educational, avenue to open them up? And my second question, excuse me, my second question would be, to what degree do you have to mine the database more now and actually consider communication activities and solicitation activities to the cross country team? You know, and versus the softball team versus the basketball team and does that become problematic? Have those records been kept accurately historically over time?
Yeah, so I think that that first question about judo and your football fanatic fan, I think it's really important to have strategy, right? And I think that's one thing that we talked about, but I didn't specifically say the word strategy in our conversation, is when we have donors like that, we have to have data on them from straight conversations with them, personal conversations to potential social media posts, things that they said to people or posted as well to understand that person and where they are. Because I think that as you get to know people on a personal level, you may find out that they had a child that played judo. They love football, but they might have that affinity. And I think that as we talk about expanding affinities, I think that the strategy with that is if you're looking to do that, a great way to do that is even though someone's a football fanatic, invite them to an event that may have some athletic touch or not for the whole university. Make them feel special and understand that we know they're a football fanatic and they love us. But we also want to let the university, people at the university know that this person's great to us. We want to expand that. So you can actually look at that as a stewardship tool to expand it. And at that point, be able to bring in that opportunity of, oh, maybe we bring up judo to them at this event. Maybe we seat them with a judo student athlete because we know that they love sports here. They may love football, but maybe they love the sports in general. And if they talk to the student and learn about them, maybe they're going to have an affinity to that as well and build out the relationship. But it has to be strategic, that relationship and those next steps. And can you repeat that second question, Scott, about the other
So
sports?
the question becomes, um, what experience have you had in terms of the accuracy of the historic data? And who played on what sport and when? And then secondly, does that become more important in this new age where you mentioned you don't want athletics to be siloed, but do you need to have, I'll call it market or vertical specific conversations with people who were volleyball, softball, track and field, et cetera? Does that become even more important in this new age?
Oh, it certainly does. And I think to what you said, Scott, we talked about communication and segmentation, right? We want these people to understand that we know who they are. We know what they've done. We know what they're a part of on a general level, right? We may not know how many wins they had. We may not know if they're a school record holder, if it's in the sports media guides from 20 plus years ago. But I think with that, it's really important for the segmentation, right? As we learn about these people, whether it's their giving, whether it's conversations, or whether it's us just sleuthing through the system to try to learn about people and then doing some research or reaching out to them for some qualitative conversation. I think that's how we do that is that direct communication, the segmentation of let's send out outreach to these players of this sport. That's exactly who we're going to hit. And then you have your segmentation of these are all of our former student athletes. And the point in that communication is to specify exactly why you're reaching out. Because I think that what happens is people will send out a mass email. To be transparent, I had someone reach out to me this morning. I received some data on our alums that I've really been working on, and I had someone reach out and he didn't reply to the email. He just sent me a new email with the name of the event in it. And I know in the email list that I have alums from '08 to 11, from 15 to 19, and from 20 to 25. So
Mhm.
but I also know that he has 88 in his email. So I'm almost guaranteed to know he's probably born in 88. But because we're a community college, he could have come later in his life, right? He
Mhm.
could have come closer to the age he's at now. He could have come, in the earlier 2000s. I don't know that, right? Because sometimes we get the graduation data, sometimes we don't. But he reached out to me and asked me a question. I could have easily answered that question and that was it. But I read an email from an individual named Amanda on LinkedIn recently, and it talked about how adding a PS to your email, I believe it was, can increase the reply rate or the open, I think it was like the reply rate by like 25+%, putting PS. So I put a PS in and I said, hey, I see that you have 88 on here. I said, I know that I have alums in this time range. I said, I'd love to know what year you grad, like when you were at Gaston College and what did you study? And I think that that's the easiest way in our work is to be curious about things and do it in a way that shows we're interested. So segmentation, communication, interest.
Well, we got a question here, and the first part is how would you suggest, a college, university track and report the impact of NIL donations? I mean, you mentioned KPIs earlier. What specifically would you share with your donor public or prospective donor public?
So I think what a lot of people are using right now to track that is open doors. I had one of their salespeople speak to my next gen fundraising group. I think it was like maybe 2-ish years ago, really when it had been around for just about a year or so. And I think people are going to find numbers however they find them, whether it's an article written about it, someone posts something on a social media, one of the athletes or another, and people can kind of garner an idea from that. I think internally, it's important to track the impact, but I think what's really important because things are continuing to change. How do I suggest a school can track and report the impact of NIL donations? I think that I would take a step back from that. And I would say you're going to track it if you're doing it with one of the programs like Open Doors.
Mhm.
But I think what needs to happen first is going to the foundation board and saying, this is where we're at. How does this come across to you? How do you feel about this? What's your view on us sharing this? Because we want to be transparent, but I think it's important to go to that small group of individuals who are to a degree representative of your donor base and say, how does this look to you to receive feedback and advice from that group? Now, what kind of data do donors respond to positively and what format is donor preferred? I mean, I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, in our community college area, NAL was, I believe for junior colleges, NIL was uh, one of the first junior colleges, one of the first to talk about it. But it's not really a huge thing here because students are getting student athletes are getting kind of lured to division one, two, three with NIL deals coming from here. We've always been the pipeline, right?
Mhm.
And we're going to continue to be the pipeline. But I think kind of the format to track that, I mean, I think it just depends on the school. In a Power Four school, people are going to know those numbers. And sometimes that's an exciting thing, right? To share with people. And if you really think about it, it can also be a good fundraising tool, depending on how you view it, where if you have a student athlete who's getting this much money, it may not look great to the other student athletes if they didn't know. And that could create an issue. But to a degree, you could also say, well, we're fully funded, whatever that means, in NIL. You can see that here. Because we're fully funded, we really need your support in these other areas. And I think like the thing with I'm doing now with sponsorships and college-wide work is maybe the focus for NIL should be on the businesses. They should be on the real sponsors versus individuals. Target and segment those businesses for NIL that's going to benefit the student athletes, and then segment your individual donors for other areas that isn't NIL, unless that's their prerogative and they really want that. We go back to that segmentation and communication of how do you want to break it up? What does your database look like? Do you have good information? And is there interest from these segments that once you've reached out to them and targeted them?
Let me ask another question. NIL obviously impacts those schools that are D1. So
Mhm,
let's roll back the clock. I went to
mhm,
Little Gettysburg College, D3
mhm,
school in Pennsylvania. If you're there and you're on a sports team, you're there as a student athlete. Do
mhm.
these same strategies that you discussed today hold true for what I would call a non-revenue generating college. I mean, we would sell tickets to the football games, but I don't think anyone would build a palace with the revenue.
Yeah, I've actually had this conversation with people lately. I had it with my own coach here recently, and we talked about how it's changing the dynamic of the divisions, and I think that's the first place to start. And this is my view of junior colleges where I am were always the pipeline. They filled division one, two, and three. And you have to look at things now and say, are you going to be at the top? Are you going to be that next rung down? Or are you just going to keep doing exactly what you're doing? And the people you get are the people you get. And I think the really important thing is to look and say, what's the mission of the institution? What are the values? And what are they looking to do? What are they looking to provide to the student athletes? And I think that's where a lot of institutions have to reflect now. We know that so many are closing right now because they don't understand their value proposition and there's been some mismanagement. And I think on the athletic side, a lot of these places need to look at themselves and say, what do we want to provide? Are we going to be a place that wants to uh, pay to get the best players? And that's okay if that's what you want to do and that's what you can do. But I think the other institutions have to look at themselves and say, are we going to provide an experience that makes student athletes want to come here and not leave, with the occasional small percentage that may, do really well and pop up to another division or another institution? Or do you want to be the place where you can have minimal, NIL, or you just focus on scholarships, but you end up being a pipeline where you build really successful athletes that get sent off? And if that's the case, you look at that like I do in terms of leadership. If you treat people really well and you can retain employees, and at a certain point they leave, but they had a great experience, they're going to tell people about that. And we know word of mouth is best. And if you have student athletes that come there and say, they developed me so well, I loved my classes, I really needed this money, so I had to go, or this or that, they're going to tell people that. And that's going to create a great pipeline. And there's going to be a significant amount of those student athletes, I believe, that will maybe say, you know what? How much money am I really going to get versus getting, my college paid for, playing at a high level, networking, getting all these opportunities? I think it has to be in an internal reflection on the institution of what do they want to do, what are their values, what's their mission, and where do they want to sit as things continue to change, and how do they see themselves fitting in that?
Yeah.
Philosophical, but that's my view.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And I really appreciate your time this afternoon. It's very timely. I've put your contact up back on the screen. Everyone will get a follow-up email tomorrow. This will be available on the website for download as soon as we edit the recording. It takes Zoom about a day to deposit that in my inbox, and then my colleague will trim it and get it available for people. But Dan, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And I know that you're happy to have anybody reach out to you, and we'll respond personally as well.
Yes, definitely. Thank you everyone for coming. Thanks, Scott, and hope everyone has a great day.
All right. Good afternoon now. Take care. Bye bye.